Native American tribes perfected fear itself, turning psychological warfare, ritual violence, and reputation into weapons powerful enough to control entire regions without fighting every battle. They were never the savages painted by colonial propaganda. They were disciplined, intelligent societies whose very names spread terror, and whose presence alone was often enough to make enemies abandon land, weapons, and hope before the first arrow was ever released. Fear was not just an emotion in Native American warfare, it was strategy. Across North America, tribes learned that the most efficient victory was the one won before the first arrow flew, or the first rifle fired, a raid timed at night, a war cry echoing from unseen canyons, a single mutilated body left on a trail, a reputation whispered from village to village. These could move entire populations, redirect trade, and decide whether a settlement survived or vanished. Fear shaped alliances, migrations, and borders long before any official treaty was signed. When Europeans and later Americans wrote about these tribes, they exaggerated brutality to justify conquest. But even their most biased accounts could not hide the truth. Many native nations were militarily brilliant. They mastered mobility, terrain, timing, and psychological pressure to such a degree that colonial armies, militias, and traders learned to avoid certain lands altogether. Their names, Comanche, Apache, Mohawk, and more, became warnings. In this documentary, those warnings are going to be decoded. If you want to understand how these tribes used fear, reputation, and intelligence to survive against overwhelming odds, subscribe to the channel, leave a like to support this work, and comment below telling us from which city you're watching. Because once you see how they turned the human mind into a weapon, you'll never look at terror in history the same way again. Fear came before the arrow, before the rifle, before the war party ever appeared on the horizon. In many Native American societies, the most effective battle was the one the enemy decided not to fight. Fear was not just a byproduct of violence. It was an intentional tool, carefully shaped and used to protect land, people, and resources in a world where open warfare was costly and survival was never guaranteed. Fear acted first as deterrence, not destruction. A tribe that gained a reputation for striking hard, punishing trespass, or hunting enemies relentlessly did not need to fight every challenger. Stories of what happened to those who crossed them traveled far ahead of the warriors themselves. Villages moved routes. Traders chose different paths. Rival raiding parties turned back. Violence, when it happened, was often as much a message as a tactical action. Do not come here. Do not test us. In this way, fear conserved lives and energy by discouraging future threats. Psychological intimidation almost always started before physical combat. Scouts, smoke signals, tracks, and distant sightings meant that both sides usually knew about each other long before contact. Tribes used this awareness to shape the enemy's emotions, approaching slowly and visibly to show numbers, or remaining invisible to create uncertainty and dread, leaving deliberate signs on the landscape, like destroyed camps or marked trees, that told anyone who found them, "You are being watched." The goal was to fill the enemy's nights with unease, to make them jump at every sound, to make rest and clear thinking impossible. War rituals played a central role in this mental pressure. Before raids or battles, warriors participated in ceremonies that had two audiences, the spirits and the enemy. Dances, chants, fasting, and ordeals hardened the warrior's resolve, but they also produced a terrifying image when seen or heard from outside. A war party painted, singing, and moving in sync under moonlight did not look like a group of individuals. It looked like something more than human, something set apart, something you did not want to face. Ritual mutilation of captured enemies, when it occurred, was not random cruelty. It was codified and symbolic, designed to send a clear message to anyone who later found the bodies or heard the story. Masks, body paint, and war cries transformed familiar faces into living symbols. Warriors used paint to divide the world into ordinary and war states, red for blood and aggression, black for death or power, white for the spirit world, depending on culture. A friend's face could become a skull, an animal or a spirit overnight. Masks carved with exaggerated features, glaring eyes, bared teeth, elongated noses, removed individual identity and replaced it with something mythic and frightening. War cries, ululations and drumming rhythms were timed to hit at the moment of contact or just before, overwhelming the enemy's senses. To a tired soldier or settler on the edge of hostile land, hearing those sounds in the darkness often broke resolve before the first spear or bullet struck. All of this depended on reputation, and reputation lived in stories. In oral cultures, memory was the archive and the weapon. Around fires, elders and veterans told of infamous raids, miraculous escapes, and brutal reprisals. Children grew up hearing which neighboring peoples always came at night, which warriors never took prisoners, which enemies never returned from certain valleys. These stories shaped behavior both ways. They taught young warriors what their own people expected of them, and they carried warnings to outsiders through captives, traders, and intertribal visitors. A single shocking event, a massacre of a trespassing hunting party, a captured war leader burned or adopted, a settlement erased, could echo for generations, long after the original weapons had rusted. Because warfare was dangerous and resource-intensive, many tribes preferred strategic displays of strength to constant combat. A large war party might appear near an enemy village, fully armed and painted, demonstrate skill with horses or weapons, sing war songs, and then withdraw, leaving no casualties but a clear impression. We can do this whenever we choose, showing large numbers at once, or deliberately letting an enemy scout escape after seeing a carefully staged camp, allowed a tribe to fight with appearance rather than blood. Even the choice of when not to attack, letting a trespasser go after a warning, could be part of the fear calculus, reinforcing a controlled, disciplined image rather than chaotic aggression. Crucially, violence was governed by cultural rules, not unleashed at random. Many native societies had strict boundaries about who could be attacked, under what conditions, and for what reasons. Some conflicts were limited to stealing horses, counting coup, or symbolic victories rather than annihilation. Others, like revenge raids or mourning wars, followed specific ritual logic. This predictability made fear more precise. Enemies knew that crossing certain lines or violating specific agreements could trigger terrible consequences, while other actions might be tolerated. That kind of structured threat is more powerful than chaos because it can be anticipated and avoided. Fear became a map. Step here and nothing happens. Step there and everything burns. In this way, fear preserved tribal survival. When populations were relatively small and every adult who could hunt or fight was precious, total war was a luxury few could afford. Psychological warfare allowed tribes to punch above their numbers, to claim territory, control routes, and deter raids without fighting every challenger to the last man. A terrifying reputation could function like an invisible wall around homelands and migration paths. It protected elders, children, and food sources by convincing potential enemies that the cost of testing those borders would be too high. Fear, then, was never just about making others suffer. It was about making them decide, on their own, that approaching, attacking, or resisting was not worth it. It was about turning the enemy's imagination into your most obedient ally. And yet, this is only the foundation. Once fear became a refined tool, some tribes turned it into an art, shaping entire regions with nothing but speed, reputation, and the knowledge that somewhere, beyond the horizon, riders might already be coming. Next, the story turns to the Comanche, the people whose mastery of the horse made their name alone a reason for armies to change course. The Comanche did not simply live on the southern plains. They ruled them, For nearly 2 centuries, their mastery of the horse and the open grasslands created a moving empire so feared that Spanish, Mexican, and American forces learned to measure risk not just by distance or supply lines, but by one question: is this Comanche country? If the answer was yes, everything changed. Routes, plans, even the will to proceed. Their dominance began with an almost supernatural command of horseback warfare. While many native nations adopted horses, the Comanche rebuilt their entire way of life around them. Children learned to ride almost as soon as they could walk. Warriors could hang off the side of a galloping horse, using the animal's body as a shield while firing arrows or, later, rifles with startling accuracy. From a distance, a Comanche rider in full motion barely looked human. He looked like a single creature fused with his horse, flowing across the plains faster than most armies could even react. This mobility was their greatest weapon. Where infantry trudged and wagons crawled, Comanche war parties flew. Their raids became legend because of how quickly they struck and how completely they vanished. A settlement might see nothing but a faint dust line on the horizon. Then, suddenly, riders were everywhere at once, cutting down isolated defenders, driving off horses, seizing captives, burning what needed to be burned. Minutes later, they were gone. Pursuers followed tracks that simply dissolved into endless grass and open sky. The Comanche knew every river crossing, every piece of high ground, every way to break a trail and then erase it. For victims, the terror was not just in what happened, but in how it happened. The attack felt less like a battle and more like being hit by a storm that rolled in out of nowhere and left no trace but fear. That fear spread in every direction. North into American frontier cabins, south into Mexican ranches and towns, east and west across Spanish missions and trade posts. Stories of Comanche raids traveled farther than their horses ever had to. Settlers repeated tales of riders appearing seemingly from empty plains, outshooting and outriding trained soldiers, and vanishing before any organized defense could form. Ranchers abandoned isolated homesteads. Caravans chose longer, more difficult routes to avoid known Comanche paths. Whole communities felt like they were living under a sky that might open at any time and release riders from the horizon. Captive taking was not random cruelty, it was an economic and strategic system. Comanche raids targeted horses, livestock, goods, and people with equal calculation. Captives could be adopted to rebuild numbers, traded to other tribes, sold to Mexican or American intermediaries, or ransomed back to their families for weapons, ammunition, or supplies. This turned fear into currency. Settlements that knew Comanches took captives also knew there might be a chance to buy them back, which meant sending envoys, admitting weakness, and acknowledging Comanche power. Every raid that ended with captives increased the Comanches' leverage over enemies and neighbors alike. Through relentless mobility and targeted violence, they built effective control over vast trade routes and hunting grounds without ever needing walls or cities. Anyone moving across the southern plains, traders, soldiers, migrants, did so with Comanche consent or Comanche risk. Bison herds, Mustang bands, and river corridors were the lifeblood of their world, and they guarded them with a mix of patrol, punishment, and warning. Raids punished trespass. Successful crossings without incident taught outsiders that safety depended on timing, tribute, or sheer luck. In effect, they drew invisible borders in open country, enforced not by maps or forts, but by the constant possibility of appearing out of nowhere. Their violence, while terrifying, was rarely random. The Comanche reputation in colonial writing often paints them as indiscriminately brutal, but patterns show something colder and more strategic: brutal efficiency. They focused on targets that mattered: horse herds, supply caravans, frontier ranches, military outposts that threatened their range. Massacres happened, especially in response to betrayal or encroachment, but sustained extermination campaigns against everyone in reach were rare and unsustainable. Violence had messages attached: don't build here, don't raid us, don't cross this river. Those who learned the message sometimes lived in uneasy peace under the shadow of Comanche power. When firearms entered the equation, the Comanche did not surrender their advantage. They rewired it. Some horse cultures struggled with slow-loading guns that clashed with fast movement. The Comanche experimented until they could fire from horseback without sacrificing speed, using pistols and later carbines as extensions of bow tactics rather than replacements. A warrior might close the distance using traditional mounted archery, then finish with a pistol at close range. They did not become static gunfighters. They remained fast-moving cavalry who happened to carry guns. This meant that even as colonial armies improved their firepower, the psychological equation did not change as much as settlers hoped. Comanche were still hitting hard, fast, and from angles that infantry drills did not prepare men for. As their power peaked, entire armies and expeditions recalibrated around one simple fear. Marching into Comanche territory meant stepping onto a chessboard where the Comanche knew every square and owned most of the moves. Supply lines were long and fragile. Horses could be stolen at night. Water sources could be ambushed. Scouts might be killed or simply allowed to see exactly what the Comanche wanted them to see. Some commanders tried to push through anyway and paid for it in men, animals, and reputation. Others chose delays, detours, or diplomacy rather than risk a campaign that, even if victorious on paper, could bleed them dry. The Comanche were called Lords of the Plains, not because they built palaces, but because they understood what the plains truly were. An ocean of grass where speed, fear, and information mattered more than fort walls or drilled formations. Their domain had no capital city. Its center was wherever their war parties chose to ride. And for everyone who lived around that domain, the sight of a dust cloud on the horizon was never just weather. It was a question: are those just horses, or are the Comanche coming? And now we turn to a different kind of terror. One born not of open plains and charging cavalry, but of mountains, canyons, and enemies who could make entire armies feel hunted every step of the way. The Apache. The Apache did not need walls, forts, or cities to make empires tremble. Their stronghold was the land itself, jagged mountains, narrow canyons, silent deserts, and they knew every pass, every spring, every hiding place in a way no invader ever could. For soldiers marching through Apache country, the landscape was not just scenery. It was an enemy that watched, waited, and struck without warning. Perfect knowledge of desert and mountain terrain was the foundation of Apache power. They understood which ravines carried sound, which ridgelines offered concealment, which rocky shelves overlooked the best ambush zones. Water sources were mapped in memory, not on paper. A hidden seep here, a seasonal pool there, a narrow canyon where a thirsty column would have no choice but to pass. To an outsider, the land looked empty and hostile. To Apache warriors, it was a living map of options, escape routes, kill zones, and refuge all woven together. Ambush warfare turned that knowledge into terror. Apache fighters rarely lined up for open-field battle against organized infantry or cavalry. Instead, they waited. A patrol might ride through a narrow pass, relaxed after hours of uneventful marching. Then, in a single heartbeat, gunfire and arrows exploded from above and from both sides. Rocks and dust rained down, horses screamed, men fell without ever seeing who shot them. Before officers could rally a response, the attackers were already melting back into rocks and brush, shifting position, perhaps hitting again further down the trail. It was fighting designed to break not just bodies, but confidence. Over time, this constant threat created psychological exhaustion in enemies. Soldiers sent into Apache territory learned to expect danger at every bend. Sleep came in short, shallow bursts. Every sound, a rock sliding, a coyote's cry, a gust of wind, could be a prelude to attack. Marching through canyons meant knowing with absolute clarity that if someone was watching from above, you would never see them in time. Some soldiers began firing at shadows or empty ridges, wasting ammunition on ghosts in their own minds. Commanders complained not only about casualties, but about frayed nerves, desertions, and morale that collapsed without a single pitched battle. Hit-and-run tactics were refined over centuries of fighting stronger, better-armed enemies. Apache bands struck only when conditions favored them, when they had surprise, elevation, better cover, or superior escape routes. They attacked supply trains rather than main columns, picked off scouts, cut telegraph lines, and stole horses under cover of night. They aimed to inflict sharp, sudden damage and then vanish before enemies could organize counterattacks. Chasing them was nearly pointless. They could scatter into small groups, disappear over ridges, or split tracks in ways that drove trackers mad. This style of war rewarded patience, discipline, and restraint. It also made opponents feel hunted, no matter how many men they had on paper. Spiritual warfare and omens added another layer to this mindset. For Apache warriors, combat was not simply a physical contest. It was tied to dreams, visions, and signs read from the natural world. Medicine men and spiritual leaders interpreted weather patterns, animal behavior, and symbolic dreams to decide when to raid or when to hold back. This did more than guide tactics. It fused belief and war, giving fighters a sense that they were aligned with forces larger than themselves. A warrior who believed he had spiritual backing moved differently, faced danger differently, and endured hardship with a different kind of resolve. On the other side, soldiers unfamiliar with this worldview often interpreted Apache persistence as almost supernatural, feeding their own fear. Apache raids were not about building empire in the European sense. They were designed to destabilize rather than conquer. A ranch burned here, a stagecoach hit there, a small fort harassed repeatedly until it felt besieged even when walls were intact. These actions made frontier life unpredictable and unsafe. Settlers abandoned isolated properties. Military planners had to divert resources to protect long supply lines and vulnerable outposts. The goal was to keep pressure constantly high, to make the cost of staying on Apache land, whether as soldier, rancher, or miner, feel intolerable. Instead of occupying every valley, they made others afraid to stay in them. Figures like Geronimo became symbols of this resistance, but they did not act alone. Leaders such as Cochise, Victorio, Nana, and many others shaped campaigns that blended negotiation, war, and relocation with grim realism. Geronimo's legend grew because he seemed impossible to catch, surrendering, escaping, reappearing, striking, then vanishing again. To American troops, he represented an entire style of warfare, unpredictable, relentless, rooted in deep familiarity with land and culture. To his own people, he was flawed and controversial, but also a reminder that survival sometimes required becoming the nightmare of those who would erase you. Apache resistance lasted so long because it did not depend on holding fixed positions. When pressure grew overwhelming in one area, bands moved to other mountains, other canyons, other Mexican or American frontiers. They shifted tactics as enemies changed, facing Spanish lancers, Mexican militias, then American cavalry, always looking for new ways to turn superior numbers and technology into liabilities. Firearms, when acquired, were used sparingly and intelligently. Sniping from cover, guarding retreats, or delivering sudden shock in ambushes, never as the centerpiece of static firefights. In the end, what terrified their opponents most was not sheer violence, but the feeling of never truly having control. Maps, orders, and numbers suggested one picture of the war. The reality on the ground was another, where a small group of warriors who knew every stone and ravine could dictate where and when fear would strike. Even in defeat, removed to reservations and prisons, the story of Apache resistance lingered as proof that modern armies could be bled, delayed, and humiliated by forces that rarely stood and fought in ways conventional doctrine recognized as proper battle. For those who marched through that harsh country, the memory that stayed was not of flags taken or lines drawn on paper, but of the unnerving sense that the land itself was allied with their enemies, and that somewhere, watching from the rocks, someone knew exactly how long they could endure. The Iroquois Confederacy turned fear into a system. where many peoples used terror in moments of crisis. The Haudenosaunee, Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, Seneca, and later the Tuscarora wove it into a structured way of war, politics, and diplomacy that reshaped the balance of power across northeastern North America. For their enemies, the most frightening idea was what could be called total war. In many tribal conflicts, the goal was limited: revenge for a killing, recovery of captives, assertion of hunting rights. For the Iroquois, especially in certain periods, war often aimed at breaking enemy communities as functioning societies. Villages could be burned repeatedly, crops destroyed, hunting territories seized, and survivors scattered, adopted, or killed. The objective was not just to win a battle, but to erase the capacity of rivals to threaten them again. This did not mean constant extermination, but it did mean that when the Confederacy committed itself, the consequences could be absolute. Ritualized torture was one of the harshest parts of that system, and it carried a clear message. Captured warriors, especially those from enemy nations considered long-term threats, could be subjected to public, prolonged suffering. This was not random sadism. It followed patterns, involved the participation of community members, and was framed in spiritual and social terms. For the captive, it was a test of courage and endurance. For the audience, it was a lesson. This is what awaits those who attack us. Stories of such scenes traveled widely, exaggerated or not, and did their work long after the fires went out. Enemies did not have to witness them directly. Hearing secondhand was enough to anchor fear in imagination. The morning wars added another more complex layer: Iroquois communities suffering loss through disease, conflict, or accident, sometimes launched wars not only for revenge, but to replace the dead. Captives could be adopted into clans, given the names and roles of those who had died, and fully integrated as kin. Others, especially warriors, might be tortured and killed as ritual compensation. This practice made war part of a larger cycle of grief, healing, and identity maintenance. Its psychological impact on neighboring tribes was enormous. The message was double-edged: offend us and you may be taken, tortured, or your community broken, but if taken, you might also be absorbed, losing your original identity entirely. Either way, the self was at risk. Political unity amplified all of this. The Iroquois Confederacy was not a single nation, but a league with a sophisticated council system and norms for making joint decisions. Where many enemies fought as fragmented competing villages or loosely allied bands, the Haudenosaunee could coordinate multi-village campaigns, share intelligence, and apply pressure in several directions at once. A rival group trying to negotiate with one nation might suddenly discover that the entire league was aligned behind a shared strategy. Unity meant that terror could be applied with consistency. Messages, threats, and promises did not come from random war leaders, but from a recognizable political structure. Terror was never their only instrument, but it was used strategically to expand influence. A destructive campaign against one nation could convince several others to accept Iroquois demands without direct fighting. Burned villages, displaced populations, and streams of captives served as visible warning signs. At the same time, the Confederacy could offer protection and alliance to communities willing to align with them, creating a carrot-and-stick system whose sharp edge everyone understood. Fear made resistance costly. Diplomacy offered a way to avoid becoming the next example. For neighboring tribes, the psychological impact was profound. The Iroquois were close enough to monitor movements, strong enough to punish trespasses, and organized enough to plan long campaigns rather than one-off raids. Some peoples shifted their settlements, migration patterns, or alliances primarily to avoid being targeted. Children grew up hearing stories of Iroquois war parties, burning towns, and captives taken far away and never seen again. Even groups that were not immediate targets often calibrated their relationships with other nations around the question of, what will the Confederacy think of this? Control then came through a blend of fear and diplomacy. The Haudenosaunee negotiated alliances, treaties, and trade agreements with skill that impressed even European observers. They could sit in council houses for days listening, speaking in metaphor and layered speech, offering peace in one breath and reminding everyone of their military record in the next. Their envoys arrived not as frantic petitioners, but as representatives of a league that had already proven it could sustain long wars and outlast multiple adversaries. That reputation gave weight to every word they spoke. Fear made their threats credible. Political sophistication made their promises valuable. Europeans both feared and relied on them, often at the same time. French, Dutch, British, and later American officials understood that Iroquois support, or at least neutrality, could determine the fate of frontier wars, trade networks, and fragile colonies. Military leaders dreaded facing Haudenosaunee warriors in the field, especially when they acted as scouts, raiders, or allied contingents guiding European-style armies through forests and along river systems. Yet these same powers courted Iroquois friendship, exchanged gifts, and attended councils where they were, in effect, asking a feared indigenous power for partnership. The Confederacy exploited this contradiction expertly, bargaining for weapons, goods, and recognition by balancing their value as allies against the implicit threat of what might happen if they chose the other side. This combination, total war capacity, ritualized terror, mourning-driven conflict, political unity, and flexible diplomacy, made the Iroquois Confederacy one of the most psychologically influential forces in early North American history. They did not only fight battles, they shaped the mental landscape in which other nations and colonizers had to operate. To live near them was to live with the knowledge that a misjudged insult, a careless raid, or an ill-timed alliance could bring down a response aimed not just at your warriors, but at your entire way of life. In that sense, the Confederacy demonstrated something many empires would later rediscover. The most efficient power is the kind that makes others govern themselves out of fear, long before the war parties ever leave the Longhouse. The Mohawk stood at the edge of the Confederacy like a drawn blade. As the easternmost nation of the Haudenosaunee, they watched the first roads, rivers, and frontiers where Europeans, rival tribes, and traders appeared. To many outsiders, Iroquois power had a Mohawk face, hard, disciplined, and terrifyingly efficient in war. Within the Iroquois Confederacy, Mohawk warriors often functioned as shock troops. They were frequently among the first to engage in raids, retaliatory strikes, or confrontations along the eastern approaches. Their homelands sat along crucial river corridors and routes leading into the interior, making them the first line of defense and the most immediate enforcers of Confederacy policy in that direction. When a strong message needed to be sent, Mohawk war parties were often the ones delivering it. That role shaped their identity. They were not only guardians, but also the visible demonstration of what it meant to challenge Iroquois power. Their battlefield reputation rested on merciless discipline rather than chaotic fury. Mohawk warriors were not simply feared for ferocity, they were feared because that ferocity was controlled. War parties moved with clear objectives: kill particular enemies, capture specific individuals, destroy chosen settlements or crops. Once committed, they did not break easily. Retreat, hesitation, or individual initiative that violated agreed plans could bring consequences inside their own ranks. To enemies, this manifested as relentless pressure. A Mohawk force that pushed an attack did so with the expectation that each man would hold his position, follow signals, and complete the task regardless of fear. The brutality seen by outsiders was not random. It was what happened when disciplined intent met targets chosen as examples. First contact encounters often began as psychological operations. When Mohawk warriors met strangers, traders, explorers, or representatives of rival nations, they understood that the initial impression could determine years of future behavior. They used silence, measured stares, organized formations, and controlled displays of weapon readiness to unsettle newcomers. A delegation arriving in a village might be greeted with a line of armed warriors, standing utterly still, painted and adorned for war, watching without visible emotion. Few words were needed to convey the message: we are not to be taken lightly. Even when negotiations were peaceful, the memory visitors carried away was of looking into faces that could as easily have been their executioners. Scalp-taking became one of the most infamous and misunderstood aspects of their psychological warfare. For Mohawk warriors and others in the region, the practice had spiritual, social, and symbolic meaning. It could mark a warrior's success, serve as proof of a kill in alliance warfare, and tie into beliefs about the enemy's spirit. But to European settlers and soldiers, the sight of scalped corpses, or the knowledge that such trophies were taken, created deep horror. Stories of savages who take scalps spread quickly, often without context, magnifying fear far beyond the actual number of victims. Mohawk war parties understood this reaction and sometimes used it deliberately. Leaving scalped enemies along trails or near forts sent a message that was instantly legible to colonial minds, even if they misread the practice's original significance. War chants and symbolic violence reinforced this image. As with many native nations, Mohawk warriors used pre-battle songs, rhythmic chants, and ritual movements to prepare themselves and to shock enemies. Hearing those sounds echoing through forests or along riverbanks, especially at night or before dawn, could rattle even experienced soldiers. Symbolic acts followed combat, weapons planted in specific ways, bodies positioned deliberately, or signs carved into trees and posts. These gestures told survivors and later travelers that this attack was not random. It was a signature, a warning, a piece of psychological graffiti left on the landscape. At the same time, Mohawk power did not rely on fear alone. Strategic alliances with colonial powers, first with the Dutch and later especially with the British, turned them into a pivotal force in imperial conflicts. Mohawk warriors acted as scouts, guides, and allied contingents in wars that Europeans fought against French forces and their native partners. This cooperation enhanced their arsenal with firearms, metal tools, and trade goods, but it also amplified their psychological reach. To France and its indigenous allies, the Mohawk were not just a local threat. They were the sharp edge of a British-aligned network that could strike across wide territories. To British commanders, they were both indispensable assets and a constant reminder that alliance came with expectations. Enemies often fled at the mere sight or rumor of Mohawk war parties. Frontier communities learned that if scouts reported Mohawk movement nearby, delay could be fatal. Some villages chose evacuation over confrontation, especially if they knew they lacked numbers or support. Rival tribes, already familiar with Iroquois methods, frequently interpreted Mohawk presence as sign that negotiations had failed and punishment was coming. Even when fighting did not occur, the possibility that it might, with all its remembered cruelty and aftermath, hung over every decision taken near their sphere of influence. In this way, fear became a protective barrier for Iroquois borders. While the Confederacy's strength rested on its collective structure, the Mohawk turned that abstract power into immediate, physical reality along the eastern frontier. Their reputation made would-be raiders think twice about striking into Iroquois territory. It made outside powers cautious when planning forts, missions, or settlements near known Mohawk zones. The cost of provoking them was written in burned towns, lost patrols, and long memories. That deterrent effect meant fewer large-scale invasions and more careful diplomacy, which in turn helped preserve Haudenosaunee autonomy longer than many other native polities enjoyed. Yet this image of the Mohawk as relentless, merciless warriors also carried a price. It made them valuable allies and terrifying enemies, but it also fed into colonial stereotypes that later erased their diplomacy, agriculture, spirituality, and internal debates. Being the guardians of the Eastern Gate meant living in a role defined by others' fear as much as by one's own choices. For those who saw their banners on the edge of the forest or heard their voices carry across the water, One thought often silenced all others: if this is only the first line of the Confederacy, what waits behind it? For the Pawnee, war was never just about territory or revenge. It was woven into a sacred worldview, where the sky, the earth, the seasons, and human blood all formed part of a single dangerous conversation with the cosmos. To neighboring peoples and later European observers, this produced some of the most feared and most misunderstood rituals on the plains. Sacred warfare meant that Pawnee campaigns were not simply strategic choices. They were often framed as responses to spiritual obligations. Cosmology and myth did not sit in the background of daily life. They explained why the stars moved, why crops grew, and why enemies existed at all. Certain times of year, particular signs in the sky, or omens observed by religious leaders could signal that the balance between people, spirits, and nature required action. War, in this framework, was not just allowed. It was sometimes mandated as part of maintaining cosmic order. That made Pawnee warfare deeply serious and, at times, terrifying. Enemies were not just fighting men, but a people who believed that the universe itself might be watching. Human sacrifice, perhaps the most infamous aspect of Pawnee ritual, embodied this misunderstanding between insiders and outsiders. For the Pawnee, especially in specific ceremonial contexts, the sacrifice of a captive girl was tied to agricultural fertility and star lore, representing a symbolic marriage between earth and sky. It was framed as solemn, structured, and spiritually necessary, not as random cruelty. Participants believed they were ensuring the survival and prosperity of the entire community. But to neighboring tribes who heard about these rites, and to Europeans who witnessed or recorded them with horror, the practice became a powerful symbol of Pawnee inhumanity. The meaning was lost. Only the fear remained. Religious symbolism amplified that fear far beyond the actual number of sacrifices or rituals. The knowledge that a captured person might be selected for ceremonial death, combined with stories of elaborate preparations, songs, and sacred regalia, gave Pawnee warfare a spiritual dread many enemies did not know how to process. It was one thing to fear being killed in battle. It was another to fear being drawn into someone else's sacred drama, your death turned into an offering to powers you did not recognize. To those outside the belief system, Pawnee war parties carried not only weapons, but a sense that the rules of ordinary life might not apply in their hands. Becoming a warrior in such a culture was itself a ritual process. Warrior initiation involved more than learning to ride and fight. Young men faced tests of courage, endurance, and obedience framed as spiritual trials. Some might undergo fasting, isolation, or ritual combat that proved their readiness to take life and risk their own for the people and the cosmic order. The first kill or first successful raid could carry ritual significance, marked with specific paint, songs, or communal acknowledgement. This initiation produced fighters who saw their role not just as practical defenders, but as sacred actors in a larger story. That conviction of fighting with spiritual backing gave Pawnee warriors a psychological edge and made them even more intimidating to foes. Priests and religious specialists played crucial roles in warfare decisions. Leaders did not simply decide to raid based on opportunity or anger. They consulted ritual authorities who read signs in the sky, interpreted dreams, or performed divinations. These religious figures could approve, delay, or cancel campaigns. They might prescribe particular taboos: what warriors should eat, how they should paint themselves, which songs to sing, or what must be done with captives. This system added layers of meaning and constraint to violence. It also meant that, from the Pawnee perspective, a raid backed by ritual sanction carried cosmic weight. Victory or defeat might be read as approval or displeasure from the spirit world. Neighboring tribes felt the psychological impact of all this, even if they did not share the beliefs. Stories about Pawnee ceremonies, sacrificial rites, and warrior customs circulated widely. Some rival groups feared capture by Pawnee more than by others. knowing their treatment might be decided not just by anger or mercy, but by ritual need. That fear shaped behavior. Bands avoided Pawnee-dominated areas, changed hunting patterns, or sought alliances to balance against them. Even when actual Pawnee raids were limited in scope, the mental picture of what might happen if you fell into their hands magnified their influence across the plains. European observers added another distorting layer. Missionaries, soldiers, and officials encountered Pawnee practices through their own religious and cultural lenses. They described rituals with moral outrage, often stripping away context and treating them as proof of barbarism. Accounts emphasized shocking details, bindings, songs, ceremonial regalia, without explaining the cosmological logic behind them. Over time, these reports hardened into stereotypes. The Pawnee became, in outside imagination, an almost ritual-obsessed people defined by sacrifice and sacred cruelty. This overshadowed their roles as farmers, traders, negotiators, and allies, reducing a complex society to a single terrifying image. The thin line between sacred duty and terror lay at the heart of how they were perceived. Inside Pawnee culture, these rituals were acts of responsibility to ancestors, to the stars, to the fields that fed everyone. They were ways of making sense of loss, drought, disease, and the violence that already defined life on the plains. Outside that culture, the same acts looked like senseless horror. That gap in understanding became its own psychological weapon. Even when Pawnee leaders sought peace or alliance, the reputation of their rituals walked ahead of them. It made others cautious, deferential, and sometimes desperate to avoid conflict. In the end, Pawnee ritualized violence forces a hard question about fear in history. When does a community's deepest sense of sacred obligation become someone else's nightmare? And how much of what we call terror is simply the shock of facing a worldview we never tried to understand? Some native nations in North America were branded Aztecs of the North, not because colonists understood them, but because they needed a label that sounded monstrous, inhuman, bloodthirsty, savage. These words appear again and again in colonial writings, pinned to tribes whose warfare, rituals, and punishments did not fit European expectations. The label said less about those nations and more about the people doing the naming. Several factors made some tribes targets for this kind of branding. Groups that used ritual torture, scalping, or spectacular forms of killing. Those who took captives for adoption, ransom, or sacrifice. Those who fought with relentless persistence or struck settlements repeatedly. These were singled out as monstrous, even when their actions followed strict cultural rules. The more effective a tribe was at resisting invasion or destabilizing colonial frontiers, the more likely its enemies were to describe it as beyond human. The message was simple. These people are not like us, so anything done to them is justified. Colonial exaggeration turned real violence into legend. Reports of raids, torture, and sacrifice were filtered through fear, racism, and political agendas. A single horrific event could be retold as routine practice. Numbers of dead grew in the retelling. Isolated atrocities became what they always do. Sensational details, bodies displayed, hearts cut out, captives burned, were highlighted while context was stripped away. Over time, these stories formed a picture of certain tribes as northern versions of the Aztecs, ritual-obsessed, blood-drenched cultures whose entire existence supposedly revolved around killing. This image was emotionally powerful and politically useful. That does not mean there was nothing real beneath the fear. Some tribes did, at times, practice forms of ritual violence that were meant to shock, terrify, and send messages. Captured warriors might be tortured in public as tests of courage and as warnings. Scalp-taking in various cultures was used as proof of victory, a marker of warrior status or part of spiritual beliefs about the enemy's essence. Certain ceremonial killings, including rare forms of human sacrifice, were tied to cosmology, fertility, or mourning. These acts were frightening even to neighboring indigenous peoples. They were designed to be. Fear worked. It could stop raids, deter trespass, or preserve territory without constant warfare. The problem was not that these things never happened, it was how they were interpreted. European and later American observers rarely understood the ritual frameworks surrounding such violence. Many tribes had rules: who could be targeted, under what circumstances, what was forbidden, what counted as honorable versus shameful killing. For them, war rituals could be about restoring balance, avenging specific wrongs, or maintaining relationships with the spirit world. Outsiders saw only cruelty, missing the logic behind it. A rite meant to honor a fallen relative, test bravery, or bind a community together became, in foreign accounts, evidence that an entire people delighted in blood for its own sake. Fear itself became a survival language. In a world where colonists brought steel, guns, disease, and legal fictions, native communities could not count on being seen as reasonable or civilized to earn respect. Instead, some leaned into reputations that made conquest look costly. If settlers believed a certain river valley belonged to warriors who tortured trespassers, they might think twice before building there. If soldiers heard that a particular nation never surrendered without inflicting terrible losses, commanders might divert campaigns elsewhere. Terrifying stories could protect a people in the short term, especially when they lacked the numbers or technology for prolonged conventional war. Meanwhile, colonial authorities and settlers used these same stories for the opposite purpose, to justify pushing those peoples off the map. By mythologizing native violence, they turned wars of land theft and expansion into necessary crusades against barbarism. Governments could present military campaigns as cleansing operations, not invasions. Massacres as tragic but inevitable responses to savage atrocities. Forced removals as acts of protection for both sides. Missionaries could demand cultural destruction in the name of saving souls from blood cults. The more horrific the image of native warfare became, the easier it was to silence critics of what was done in response. Separating truth from these fear narratives requires seeing both the blade and the hand that pointed at it. On one side, there were real acts of terror, raids that wiped out settlements, rituals that inflicted intense suffering, practices that turned captured bodies into symbols. These were part of how some nations tried to survive, impose boundaries, or uphold sacred obligations. On the other side, there were pens and printing presses turning those acts into propaganda, selectively quoted, stripped of context, exaggerated, and repeated until Aztecs of the North sounded like fact instead of slur. Who truly benefited from these stories? In the long run, not the tribes who were branded with them. They gained short-term deterrence but paid in long-term dehumanization. The real winners were colonial powers and later national governments, along with settlers hungry for land. They could depict expansion as a moral duty, replacements and reservations as civilizing, and their own brutalities. Scorched earth campaigns, mass removals, boarding schools, as regrettable but necessary steps to deal with inhuman enemies. The fear that once shielded native communities was turned back on them as a weapon of erasure. The Aztecs of the North label tells us less about the people it was pinned on and more about how fear can be manufactured, weaponized, and then preserved as history. It asks a difficult question of anyone reading today. When we hear about terror in the past, are we hearing a clear account of what happened, or the story that conquerors needed us to believe so their victories would look like justice, not conquest? They never needed empires to wage psychological war. No marble capitals, no standing armies, no bureaucracies of conquest, only small, mobile groups who understood that the human mind breaks far sooner than the body, and that a perfectly timed strike can accomplish what legions failed to do. Many native nations operated without permanent armies in the European sense. Warriors were not salaried soldiers in uniform, but hunters, farmers, and community members who could assemble into war parties when needed, and then melt back into daily life. This did not make them less dangerous. It made them harder to predict and harder to destroy. There were no central barracks to burn, no full-time regiments to track. Instead, there were networks of kin, alliances, and war societies that gathered when threat or opportunity demanded, struck with precision, and dispersed before enemies could lock them into conventional campaigns. Silence was one of their most potent weapons. On frontiers where settlers and soldiers expected drums, marching, and trumpets as signs of danger, the absence of sound became terrifying. A patrol might ride for days through forest, prairie, or canyon, hearing nothing but wind and animals, until in an instant everything erupted. The quiet before an attack was not accidental, it was cultivated. Scouts moved noiselessly, communication relied on gestures, and war parties approached downwind, using natural cover. Over time, soldiers learned to mistrust calm. A still night, a peaceful trail, an empty tree line all became sources of anxiety. When silence itself makes you nervous, the enemy has already entered your head. Manipulating morale became a core strategy. Instead of trying to annihilate every column or settlement, war parties targeted nerves, killing scouts to blind commanders, ambushing supply wagons to starve garrisons, sniping from long range to make men feel watched, or attacking briefly at night to ruin sleep. They aimed for disruption, not necessarily decisive battles. A unit might lose only a few men in each encounter, but lose them in ways that felt arbitrary and unstoppable, one moment drinking water, the next hit by an unseen shot from the scrub. Officers reported not just casualties, but growing unwillingness among their men to patrol certain routes or enter particular valleys. Morale decayed slowly, like wood eaten from the inside. Terrain was not a backdrop, it was an ally. Native warriors chose when and where to fight with ruthless selectivity. They favored narrow passes, broken ground, river crossings, ridge lines with good cover and clear escape routes, places where numbers meant less, and local knowledge meant everything. A small party on home terrain could inflict damage on a much larger force struggling with unfamiliar slopes, sudden drop-offs, or dense cover. Sometimes the mere knowledge that an enemy knew the land better was enough to change behavior. Soldiers marched tighter, slowed down, and burned energy and ammunition on defensive fire. The landscape itself seemed to lean toward the defender's side, turning every hill into a possible ambush and every ravine into a trap. Fear, used effectively, became an alternative to mass slaughter. Killing everyone in a column or village took time, ammunition, and risk. Terrifying them into retreat or compliance took far less. A single well-chosen attack, like wiping out the lead and rear of a marching line, or burning one exposed homestead while leaving others untouched, could send a message more powerful than a larger, costlier battle. We can reach you whenever we want. We choose when you live or die. Once that belief took root, entire regions could be controlled by relatively few fighters. People moved away, travel narrowed to safe corridors, and commanders wrote careful reports explaining why prudence demanded avoiding certain areas. Fear did the work of an empire without the overhead. Even retreat could be turned into intimidation. Strategic withdrawal, to European-trained officers, looked like weakness. But in many native strategies, pulling back at the right moment set up future psychological wins. A war party might strike, vanish, then allow pursuers to advance into more dangerous terrain, or they might give ground deliberately, letting enemies occupy abandoned camps that looked hastily deserted, only to surround them at night, when fatigue and overconfidence peaked. Over time, soldiers began to suspect any advance that felt too easy. Are we chasing them, or being led? That doubt turned every step forward into a source of tension. When your enemy can make you fear even your own apparent success, they have bent your mind to their tempo. Reputation functioned as armor. Tribes and specific bands built names for themselves, never breaking under fire, always retaliating for losses, appearing out of nowhere, or recovering captives against impossible odds. These reputations spread through prisoners, deserters, traders, and terrified survivors. A war party's actual size or current strength mattered less than what opponents believed about them. If a unit was known for never taking prisoners, defenders might fight more desperately or avoid combat entirely. If another was known for clever ambushes, soldiers might refuse to patrol their territory without heavy reinforcements. Reputation shielded warriors long before they arrived, making enemies adjust, overcommit, or withdraw based on fear of what might happen rather than what was guaranteed. When modern armies, drilled in formal tactics and taught to think in lines, fronts, and set-piece battles, collided with these methods, the results were often humiliating. Officers trained to read maps and deploy formations struggled against opponents who refused to stand still and be properly fought. Reports home spoke of ghosts, invisible enemies, and cowardly tactics, words that masked a more painful truth, that highly trained troops were being outthought and outmaneuvered by smaller forces without forts, uniforms, or centralized command. The psychological impact was severe. Men who had believed themselves part of the most advanced militaries on Earth found themselves afraid of shadows, unwilling to stray far from fort walls, and increasingly resentful of campaigns that seemed to bleed them for no clear gain. In the end, psychological warfare without empires revealed a harsh reality. You do not need a capital, a flag planted on every hill, or endless ranks of soldiers to dominate a landscape. You need timing, knowledge, patience, and an intimate understanding of how fear rewires human behavior. These tribes learned to use that understanding as their shield and their sword, turning the emptiest spaces on the map into places where even the mightiest armies felt small. Fear was never the full story, but it often kept the story from ending. For many native nations, terror was not some sadistic hobby. It was one of the only tools available to hold back enemies with more guns, more people, and more political power. When your population is small, your resources limited, and your neighbors or invaders are countless, the ability to make others hesitate can be the difference between survival and disappearance. Fear preserved cultures against extinction by stretching the meaning of defense far beyond simple battlefield victory. A terrifying reputation could protect hunting grounds, sacred sites, and migration routes without requiring constant warfare. If invaders believed that crossing a certain river meant facing raids, torture, or relentless pursuit, some simply did not cross. That hesitation bought time. Time for children to grow, elders to teach, ceremonies to continue, and food stores to be gathered. A village that others feared to attack had more breathing room to remain itself. In that sense, every story that made outsiders step back, every rumor of those people you don't mess with, shielded language, songs, and memory. The warriors at the center of those stories were not protecting flags or marble halls. They were protecting families, food, and fragile homelands. European empires sent armies to defend trade networks and royal prestige. Native fighters often went to war because someone had stolen their horses, killed their kin, encroached on their winter ground, or threatened the delicate balance of their community. Their front lines were the edge of cornfields, the bend in a river, the pass that led into their valley. When they used terror, through ambushes, displays of mutilated enemies, or relentless harassment, they were not serving some abstract imperial ideal. They were trying to ensure that their children could wake up the next day in the same world their ancestors had known. But there was a cost to maintaining terrifying reputations. A tribe known for never backing down or for extreme reprisals could find itself locked into cycles of escalation. If everyone expects you to respond with overwhelming violence, any sign of restraint might be read as weakness, tempting new challenges. Young warriors raised on stories of legendary cruelty or ferocity felt pressure to live up to them, even when the community might have needed diplomacy more than vengeance. Constantly being feared also made it harder to be seen as anything else, as farmers, artists, parents, diplomats. Inside the community, that image could warp identity. Outside it, it became a trap. Colonization deepened that trap by tearing away the context while keeping the fear. As disease, forced removals, broken treaties, and militarized campaigns shattered native societies, many of the ritual frameworks that once explained violence were disrupted or outlawed. Languages holding the logic and nuance of war customs were suppressed. Ceremonies that balanced aggression with obligation or that transformed captives into kin rather than corpses were banned or interrupted. What remained in the colonial record were fragments, reports of tortures, raids, and sacrifices stripped of the beliefs, debates, and restrictions that once framed them. The traditions that had made violence meaningful and limited were often the first to be lost or criminalized. In their place, colonizers rewrote history using fear-based stereotypes. Tribes that had used psychological warfare effectively became caricatures: bloodthirsty savages, inhuman raiders, Aztecs of the North. These labels flattened centuries of adaptation, diplomacy, agriculture, trade, and spiritual life into a single dimension: brutality. School books and popular stories repeated the most shocking episodes while ignoring the surrounding pressures: land theft, broken promises, and relentless military encroachment that pushed native nations toward desperate measures. The image stuck because it served a purpose. If your enemy is a monster, your own actions against them never need deep moral examination. Today, a slow but powerful re-evaluation of native warfare is underway. Historians, indigenous scholars, and community elders are piecing together oral histories, archaeological evidence, and reread colonial documents with native perspectives centered. What once looked like random savagery now appears as calculated strategy from people fighting with limited options against overwhelming odds. Guerrilla tactics are recognized as sophisticated responses to terrain and technology. Ritual violence is examined within religious and social frameworks rather than dismissed as pure cruelty. Captive taking is understood as part of complex systems of adoption, ransom, and population recovery, not simply sadism. The focus shifts from shock to structure: why these methods evolved, what they protected, and what they cost. This re-evaluation brings tensions between cultural pride and historical trauma. For some descendants, the stories of relentless warriors, unbroken resistance, and terrifying reputations are sources of strength, a reminder that their ancestors did not simply submit, but fought creatively and fiercely to keep their people alive. For others, those same histories carry deep pain, memories of being both feared and dehumanized, of internal pressures to be hard enough, of ancestors forced into roles they might never have chosen in a peaceful world. Communities must navigate how to honor the courage and tactical brilliance of their forebears without romanticizing the scars those strategies left on both their own people and others. Ultimately, the lesson is that fear should never erase humanity. To view these tribes only through the lens of terror is to see them exactly as colonial propaganda wanted us to, as obstacles, not as nations, as threats, not as thinkers, caretakers, artists, theologians, and strategists. The same people who designed ambushes and psychological tactics also planted fields, told stories to children, negotiated treaties, and mourned their dead. They laughed, doubted, argued, prayed. They wrestled with moral questions about when violence was justified and when it crossed a line, questions that any society under existential threat eventually faces. Fear kept some of their worlds intact longer than anyone expected. But if fear is all we remember about them, then the final victory belongs not to those warriors, but to those who turned their most desperate survival tools into permanent caricatures. The real power of their legacy, then, is not in the nightmares they inspired across colonial frontiers, but in what their choices reveal about how far human beings will go, not for empire or glory, but simply to remain who they are in a world determined to erase them. These tribes were never the monsters that colonial stories tried to make them. They were brilliant survival strategists in a world where numbers, technology, and political power were stacked against them. When you cannot field massive armies or build stone fortresses, you either learn to weaponize fear through reputation, terrain, timing, and psychological pressure, or you vanish. For the Comanche, Apache, Iroquois, Mohawk, Pawnee, and many others, terror was not entertainment. It was a shield over children, food, language, and land. Their legacy forces a hard look at how terror appears in history. So often the groups labeled as nightmares are the ones fighting not for empire, but for the right to keep existing. Colonial writers recorded their most shocking tactics, but rarely the pressures that created them: invasion, broken promises, disease, and endless encroachment. When we step back, the pattern is clear. Fear was a language of survival, and those who used it best were remembered as horrors, while those who drove them to that edge wrote themselves as heroes. If you want more stories that break the myth of savage versus civilized and expose the mind games behind history, subscribe to the channel, leave a like to support this work, and comment telling us from which city you're watching. Because once you see how fear, reputation, and survival are braided together, you'll never hear the word terror in history the same way again.